Okay, well, I'm sure people will continue to file in, but I'll just read my introduction piece, introduce everyone and our sponsors. So good afternoon and welcome to the launch of Dr. David Harrisville's new book, The Virtuous Wehrmacht, Crafting the Myth of the German Soldier on the Eastern Front, 1941 to 1944, now out with Cornell University Press in their Battlegrounds series. I'm Professor Chad Gibbs. I'm the director of the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies at the College of Charleston, and I'll be serving as chair for our event today. Please be aware that the event is being recorded. We'll keep on the recording until we make it to the Q&A portion of the event. I have a few acknowledgements and introductions to make, as well as some technical details to discuss before I hand things over to David for him to tell us about his excellent new book. First, I'd like to acknowledge the staff and supporters of the organizations underwriting today's event. This book launch is made possible by the University of Wisconsin-Madison's History Department, Sky Doney and the George L. Mosse Program in History at the UW-Madison, the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies at the College of Charleston, and the UW-Madison Center for European Studies. We thank them all for bringing us together today. David's discussion of his book will be followed today by comments from Professor Thomas Kühne. Professor Kühne is the director of the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University, where he holds the Strassler Chair in Holocaust History. He teaches modern European and German history with a focus on the Holocaust and Nazi Germany. His research explores the place of war and genocide in long-term traditions of political culture and political emotions, and of the Holocaust and Nazi Germany in the continuities and discontinuities of the 20th century. He's been awarded fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the Center for Contemporary History in Germany, and the German Research Foundation. He won the German Bundestag Research Prize for his dissertation on elections in Imperial Germany. His publications include 14 books in German, English, Italian, Japanese, Turkish, and other languages. Most recently, the monographs The Rise and Fall of Comradeship, Hitler's Soldiers, Male Bonding, and Mass Violence in the 20th Century, which was with Cambridge University Press in 2017, and Belonging and Genocide, Hitler's Community, 1918-1945, which was with Yale University Press in 2010. He's currently working on a synthetic book on Holocaust perpetrators, their mindsets and their interactions, and the way they've been looked at since the time of the Holocaust. And our author today is Dr. David Harrisville. David specializes in the history of the Third Reich and the Second World War. He received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2017, where he served as a teaching assistant and later a lecturer and postdoctoral fellow. He's held several fellowships, including at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem through the George Mosse program and the Freie Universität in Berlin. From 2018 to 2019, he served as a visiting assistant professor of modern European history at Furman University here in South Carolina. He's written several book chapters and articles about the Wehrmacht and the moral and religious dimensions of the war on the Eastern Front. His book, an outgrowth of his dissertation, is the product of over 8 years of research and writing in over a dozen archives in the United States, Israel, and Germany. In 2017, an early version of this manuscript was recognized with an honorable mention by the Society for Military History with their Edward M. Kaufman First Manuscript Award. Today, David will provide a discussion of his book, followed by comment from Professor Kühne, and then a Q&A from our audience that I'll facilitate by reading those questions from the Q&A that you can type in. So without further delay, let me hand it over to David Harrisville.
All right, well, thanks very much, Professor Gibbs, for that introduction, and I do hope you are enjoying your time in Charleston. Let me share my screen here. I've got a few slides to go along with my presentation. All right, is everyone seeing my book cover there? Hopefully, yes. All right.
We are.
So welcome everyone. And thanks again for the introduction. Thanks very much to my friend of many years, Sky Doney, for putting this event together, as well as to all of our sponsors. And especially thanks to Professor Kühne for agreeing to provide comments today. I have to say that the number of books he has written is rather intimidating. This is only my first one, but his work on the Wehrmacht and the dynamics of the Holocaust have had a big influence on my own work. When we planned this talk months ago, I certainly didn't expect that there would be another war on the Eastern Front in Eastern Europe, that is today, but that is the situation we find ourselves in now. It looks like, unfortunately, the history of World War II is more relevant than ever. And while my talk today isn't specifically about Ukraine, I hope it does provide some level of background on the history of the region. And I can only hope that this war will not look anything like the war that we saw 80 years ago, although I don't know how optimistic to be. So I'd like to start today by providing a little bit of historical and historiographical background to my study, especially those who aren't so familiar with the topic. Then I'll present my major arguments, and I'll provide you a kind of survey of how I support those arguments. I know many books have already been written about the Wehrmacht. In fact, I was doing an Amazon search the other day, and I found more than 6,000 titles. So you could say it's a kind of oversaturated market. But I believe that through the lens of moral history, my work offers a new perspective that can transform our understanding of the worldview of the German soldier in the Second World War, the nature of the Wehrmacht, that is the German military as an institution, and the origins of one of the most persistent features of German memory in the latter half of the 20th century. In a larger sense, I also hope to contribute to our knowledge of the moral history of the Third Reich and the psychology of violence. And for those of you who are wondering, I don't actually believe that the Wehrmacht was virtuous, but I believe that many of the men who fought in the Wehrmacht believed that they were. And a lot of my work tries to answer the question of how did they possibly believe that? But first, I want to provide just a little bit of historical context. So last year was the 80th anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany. The single largest offensive in modern military history, it involved over 3 million men of the Wehrmacht. The Eastern Front would go on to become the biggest theater of the Second World War, where over 30 million German and Soviet soldiers and civilians would lose their lives. The Soviets' ultimate victory over the Germans was of decisive importance for the outcome of the war. And in my research on the Wehrmacht, I focused on the Eastern Front because the majority of German soldiers served there and because it became a focal point of German memory after the war. So for many decades after the end of World War II, public memory of the Wehrmacht in Germany, and not just Germany, but also the US and abroad, was dominated by what scholars now term the myth of the Wehrmacht's clean hands, or the clean Wehrmacht myth. And according to this myth, the army fought a relatively conventional war, did not commit atrocities, and maintained an apolitical distance from the Nazi regime, all in contrast to organizations like the SS or the Gestapo. According to this myth, the average soldier was a decent, honorable man caught up in events beyond his control who could not be blamed for the crimes of Hitler's regime. And this will be important to my argument. According to just about everyone who studied the myth, it's seen as a distinctly post-war phenomenon. Historians argue that it was created in the late 1940s and early 1950s by men like Admiral Dönitz, who declared in a speech at the end of the Third Reich that the army had fought honorably. The myth was nurtured by former generals who whitewashed the army's history, by politicians like Konrad Adenauer in Germany and Dwight Eisenhower in the United States, who helped to revitalize the army's image in pursuit of Cold War goals, and by a justice system that failed to prosecute more than a handful of Wehrmacht personnel. But beginning in the 1960s and the 1970s, historians began to delve deeper into the Army's history and started to question all of these assumptions. Over the next decades, and I'm making a very long story very short, scholars have systematically dismantled the Wehrmacht myth. Today, we understand that the war on the Eastern Front was not a conventional war, but a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of extermination waged to further the Nazi regime's goal of destroying Jewish Bolshevism and either killing or enslaving these supposedly subhuman populations of Eastern Europe while securing Lebensraum for the German people. Researchers have uncovered a pattern of unprecedented criminality by the Wehrmacht. The army destroyed some 70,000 villages, starved to death over 3 million prisoners of war, created immense hardship for the population through mass theft, pursued a terroristic occupation policy, and played an important role in the Holocaust. We have also found that the army and its leadership were deeply influenced by Nazism, and that the average soldier often either personally took part in crimes or at least was aware of them. And on your screen here are a couple of images illustrating this. On the left is an image of civilians being executed on the Eastern Front for being suspected resistors. And on the right are soldiers walking past a burning village because scorched earth practices were very common on the Eastern Front. Thankfully, since the mid-1990s, the tide of the Wehrmacht myth has started to recede among the German public, although there's still plenty of progress to be made. So that is the basic historical and historiographical context surrounding the army and its crimes. But as I went into German archives, one of the things that struck me the most was the fact that if you look at the writings of soldiers during the war, it's plainly apparent that they did not consider themselves to be criminals fighting on the side of evil, quite the opposite. They continually insisted that they were virtuous men fighting for a worthy cause against a despicable enemy. And on your screen, I have a couple of quotations that illustrate this. For example, Private Wilhelm Moldenhauser wrote to his wife that, quote, "And now the Germans are here, and the people can always see for themselves that the Germans are decent, nice guys." Private Franz Ziebler wrote to his parents, quote, "Let all of our previous wars be as they may, just or unjust. Let them be the machinations of diplomats. One thing, however, is certain. This war against the criminal work of Bolshevism is the battle for a righteous cause." I could give many more examples, but what became clear to me is that despite all of these atrocities that their side was committing, German soldiers seemed to have been genuinely convinced that they were the good guys. And it wasn't just individual soldiers. If you look at many of the orders issued by Wehrmacht commanders or the writings of propagandists, you see a similar picture, an army that insisted on its own virtue and the righteousness of its cause. And here I have just one quotation from a newspaper written for the troops. Quote, "The cultured world knows that the German soldier at every time and in every place fights openly and honestly. Defamations cannot dissuade him from the decency of his way of fighting." So here we have, what we understand now about what was going on the Eastern Front compared to the apparent self-understanding of many of the men who were involved at the time. And there's a gigantic gap between them. So this gap led me to approach the history of the Wehrmacht in a new way, I think, from a new perspective, the perspective of moral history. So instead of asking, why did soldiers fight? What atrocities did they commit? Or why did they win certain battles? I decided to investigate the ideas about right and wrong that were present in the Wehrmacht and how these were used to justify its actions. I wanted to delve deeply into the psychology of the individual soldier, while also bringing more nuance to our understanding of the Wehrmacht as a whole. So this brings me to the major questions of my study. And I have really three principal ones. The first question I arrived at was, how did German soldiers on a moral level reconcile themselves to participating in this war of extermination, this essentially criminal invasion? How did the bad guys convince themselves they were the good guys? And I believe this is an important question because soldiers who think that they are fighting for a righteous cause, who think they're virtuous, tend to be much better soldiers than ones who are constantly questioning their side. And perhaps even they're more willing to go to the extremes because they believe that the ends justify the means. So that is the first central question. My second question is, what was the Wehrmacht's moral landscape like? What value systems influenced its rhetoric and its actions? So what kind of moral world were these soldiers living in? And this kind of inevitably led me into a pretty old debate about to what extent was the Wehrmacht dominated by Nazi ideology. So that became a big part of the project. And then my final question kind of came out of the first two, and that is, where did the Wehrmacht myth come from? Was it really this post-war phenomenon created by, say, politicians or generals after the war, or is there a better explanation of where it came from and why it was so popular? So in order to understand the moral history of the Wehrmacht, we need to know just a little bit about the moral history of the Third Reich. So I wanted to say a word about a couple of the terms that I use throughout the study. And the first one is Nazi morality. So many historians, such as Claudia Kühne, have recently pointed out that Nazism had a major influence on how Germans thought about right and wrong. She argues that the Third Reich's leaders were not amoral, as they're often portrayed. Instead, they championed a new moral system that Kühne has termed Nazi morality. According to Nazi morality, anything that helped the superior German race in its struggle with lesser races was redefined as good. Anything that hindered racial supremacy was evil. Germans were encouraged to pledge their loyalty to Hitler, to form a pure racial community, and to destroy racial enemies without mercy. So this is one influence on kind of moral thinking in the Third Reich, and by extension in the Wehrmacht. On the other hand, as scholars like André Minot and Raphael Gross have pointed out, Germans were also impacted by values and value systems that preceded Nazism. These included the Jewish and Christian moral systems with their emphasis on the Ten Commandments and the Golden Rule, middle-class norms like the importance of cleanliness, education, and family, a military honor code that told soldiers not to harm innocent civilians and to act with chivalry. And finally, an idea that Isabel Hull has termed military necessity, an idea that was fairly popular in the army, that anything that brought a quick victory could save lives and was morally defensible. And it looks like these two ways of thinking about right and wrong had absolutely nothing to do with each other. But one thing that I found, that also I think Professor Kühne has found in his research, is there could be considerable overlap between the two of them. And I'll talk about that a little more in a bit. So now a word on the sources I use for the book. So I used a core sample of over 2,000 letters written by 30 Wehrmacht soldiers who fought across all sectors of the Eastern Front, along with several diaries. And this is a picture of one of those letters. You can see a lot of them are handwritten, and certainly took a very long time to learn how to decipher German handwriting from the 1940s. The men I study fought in many different units, mostly on the front lines, and I tried as best I could to make them reflective of the diversity of German society as well as the Wehrmacht itself. Most of them come from a collection of the Museum für Kommunikation in Berlin, and what's unique about them is that there are many letters available from each individual soldier. So they provided a sense of how each soldier's thinking and behavior changed over the course of the war. And I argue in the book that letters help us to understand really two things. One is the construction of identity by the writers, but also how they portrayed themselves to their readers, how they wanted to be seen. So another set of sources comes from the institution of the Wehrmacht. So many studies of the Wehrmacht focus either on the soldiers at the bottom or the generals at the top, but I tried to combine these different approaches. So I incorporated sources from the upper echelons of the Wehrmacht, including propaganda, orders, reports by chaplains, intelligence reports, and other documents that provide context surrounding the letters, often from the same units that the men were in. And then finally, and this is another thing that's often ignored in military history, I try to incorporate documents from the German home front, including from the Nazi regime, the churches, and German newspapers. Because one thing that I make as a kind of side point is that the front and the home front had a great impact on each other and should not just be treated in isolation. So now I want to say a word on how other folks have looked at these questions and then my answers. So to the extent that these questions have already been researched, I generally find that there has been a very strong emphasis on Nazi ideology and Nazi morality over the past couple of decades of research. So to the question of how did German soldiers possibly believe they were in the right, a lot of historians, and I think especially of Omer Bartov or Stephen Fritz, more recently Bryce Sate, have argued that they had imbibed Nazi morality or Nazi ideology to such an extent that they believed what they were doing was right. So this is one potential answer to this question. To the moral landscape of the Wehrmacht, again, there's been a major emphasis on ideology in the Wehrmacht as probably the most important single influence on its actions and on its words. And there are some historians who point out there were older value systems at play and a dose of pragmatism, but I generally find the kind of ideology thesis to be one of the most common. And then finally, to the third question, as I mentioned before, most historians believe that the myth is a post-war phenomenon, a kind of whitewashing after the fact. So now, excuse me, I'd like to present my answers to these questions. So to the first question of how soldiers believed they were in the right, I argued that it was not just through Nazi ideology, but perhaps even more so through traditional morality that they were able to convince themselves that they were good men fighting for a righteous cause. In terms of the Wehrmacht as an institution, I argued that it was certainly transitioning toward Nazi morality, but this transition was not complete. As a result, the army did not always perfectly follow ideological prescriptions. And indeed, it fairly regularly did things that went completely against the wishes of Nazi leaders. But I argue that this made the army far more effective and far more dangerous than historians have recognized. It was able to appeal to a broader mass of soldiers of different backgrounds while pursuing flexible policies in the field. And finally, to the question about where did the Wehrmacht myth come from, I argue that it was created not after the war, but during the war. And it was created by ordinary soldiers who wrote about 10 billion letters from their foxholes. And in these letters, they spun a misleading narrative about themselves and about their actions that contradicted the realities of the Eastern Front and was accepted by Germans back home before the war even ended. So now I want to provide a kind of survey of how I defend these arguments. It's going to necessarily have to be pretty brief. So think of it as kind of a preview of coming attractions. And of course, I go into much more detail in the book itself. So if you're a soldier, how do you convince yourself that you're the good guy? Well, one way to do that is to write about all of your virtuous qualities in your letters. And this picture here was an image drawn by one of the soldiers I study, Hans Albring. It's a self-portrait, I think drawn in 1942, which I find particularly haunting. So one thing I investigate is how soldiers wrote about themselves to their readers. And here I tried to make a kind of chart. I hope it's helpful and not confusing. But essentially what I found is that soldiers very often use the language of traditional morality to describe themselves. So they talk about bravery, honor, duty, sacrifice, ideas that had purchased in German society for a very long time, much preceded Nazism, and would have been recognizable during the First World War as well. But they didn't just write about how good they were, they also wrote about the nice things they did. They wrote about giving money to charity. They sent flowers home to their families. And one of the biggest surprises I had in the archives is actually opening up letters and dried flowers kept falling out. So they were sending flowers to their families back home. And overall, they presented their readers with an image of themselves as honorable, decent men whom their families could be proud of. At the same time, although I would say to a somewhat lesser extent, I also found overt expressions of Nazi morality, soldiers emphasizing their devotion to Hitler, their lack of mercy toward Germany's enemies, their twisted Nazi version of masculinity, and so forth. And I also found, however, a kind of gray area in between where traditional moral values could blend into Nazism. Bravery could easily translate into bravery while destroying the racial enemies of Germany. Comradeship, as Professor Kühne has pointed out in his own research, could overlap with Nazi ideas of the biological racial community. So overall, what I found was some soldiers, I'd say probably a majority of the ones I studied, who tended to fall back on traditional moral concepts to describe themselves as virtuous men, with others emphasizing their status as good Nazis. And then you have this murky area of overlap, where often the same man will kind of mix and match different values in his writings. So when I looked, that's the kind of the level of the ordinary men. When I looked at the institutional level, I found something similar. Nazi values were constantly being preached by Wehrmacht commanders and propagandists. Soldiers were told to show no mercy toward Jews, communists, or resistors of any kind. So it's very clear that Nazi ideology formed an enormous part of the Wehrmacht's rhetoric and actions. However, one thing that really struck me is that servicemen were also constantly being told how decent and honorable they were. And a surprising number of orders that generals issued told the men to act with dignity, to refrain from harming the innocent, and to make sure to follow regulations. And this is just one small example from Panzer Group 3. Quote, events of the last days provide renewed occasion to emphasize that the troops must unconditionally behave correctly toward the civilian population. The trust of the population toward the German Wehrmacht and their happiness at being liberated, more on that in a minute, from the Soviet regime, should not be reversed into the opposite through incorrect or unfortunate conduct on the part of the troops or the organizations connected to the army. So was this a case of officers just being pragmatic? Was it a reflection of the Army's old honor code or other value systems? Either way, I argue that statements like these help soldiers to view their institution as honorable and law-abiding rather than as a criminal organization. So here you already see many of the elements of Wehrmacht myth coming together. And I also look at how soldiers wrote about their enemies as racially inferior and morally inferior, but I had to kind of cut that part out for time. So now I want to talk about atrocities. So there was a major problem with this basic self-image of the virtuous soldier. And that is the fact that the Wehrmacht was committing atrocities on a regular basis. So one of the topics that I look at in the book is how soldiers talked about their side's own crimes. And originally I didn't think they would talk about them at all, but I found that they actually talked about them quite often and quite openly, ranging from stealing property from civilians to mass murder. And in many cases, they appear to have recognized that what they were doing fell outside the normal boundaries of what could be considered acceptable. However, I found that soldiers used these moments in their letters to develop a wide range of moral justifications for their actions. And here I've listed a couple of sort of categories. There are more that I don't include here. Ideology is one way they justified what they were doing, especially in crimes against Jews or crimes against communists. But I also found a host of what social psychologists consider kind of run-of-the-mill moral rationalizations. Arguments about how the Soviets committed crimes first, so our crimes are really just kind of a form of justice. Arguments about personal need, that we're going hungry, therefore we had to steal food from civilians, even though in fact soldiers tended to be better fed than the civilian population. There's a lot of rhetorical sleight of hand and euphemisms, making it sound like crimes aren't really crimes. Like we didn't steal from civilians, they actually gave, they gave items to us because the civilians are so generous to us. So making it sound like there was kind of a friendly relationship when it really wasn't. Arguments about military necessity, like we had to destroy the village because we had to stop the Soviets from advancing. So by the end of the war, and so many of these arguments I would consider to be under the heading of kind of traditional morality, arguing that what they're doing is just and it is justifiable. By the end of the war, soldiers had informed their loved ones fairly extensively about the Army's war crimes, I would argue. In fact, one of the conclusions I draw here, and I've heard that Chad has some of his students here, so I wanted to emphasize this. I believe that Germans at home were receiving a pretty steady stream of information about the Holocaust, among other atrocities. I found about something like 2% of their letters talked about the murder of Jews or the mistreatment of Jews. And if you extrapolate that out, you could be talking about 200 to 300 million letters about the Holocaust. So as they constructed the Wehrmacht myth, soldiers effectively preempted any critical examination of the Army's crimes by essentially acting as their own judge and jury, pronouncing themselves innocent and closing their own case. And Germans at home who were reading their letters seem to have accepted this judgment. So defending their crimes was another way in which they maintained this idea that they were somehow the good guys. As the Army was attempting to create a virtuous image of itself and defend threats against that image, it was also developing moral justifications for the war as a whole. One of these, which certainly surprised me, was the notion that the invasion constituted a religious crusade against atheist communism. And here is a cartoon that I found in the archives of the British Archbishop of Canterbury putting a halo on Joseph Stalin's head. Although Stalin was very well known for persecuting the church in Russia. So when the war started, Hitler, Goebbels, the German churches, and the Army's chaplains all declared that it had a religious dimension. According to this logic, the Wehrmacht was both destroying a godless power and bringing religion back to a land where Christians had suffered persecution. And what I found in soldiers' letters is a surprising number of troops who really grabbed hold of this crusade idea and made it one of their central justifications for participating in the war. And on the slide here, I have one quotation to illustrate that. Quote, "The hope grew again in me that in a free Ukraine, perhaps also Christian preaching would be possible again. This wish is also a goal for me, for which it is worth fighting." So early on, thousands of soldiers helped to reopen churches that the Soviets had closed, and in some cases even worshiped side by side with Soviet civilians. And I've written an article elsewhere about this. Throughout the war, they celebrated Christian holidays and maintained the belief that they were good Christian warriors in contrast to their atheist enemies. And here we have a couple of images. The one on the left is the interior of a church in the Soviet Union. This is a German propaganda photo showing machinery because the church had been turned into a factory, which was quite common in the Soviet Union. And then on the right is a picture of a town in, I believe it's Eastern Poland, where the Germans are allowing churches to reopen again. So you see the population there. So throughout the war, German soldiers are maintaining this idea that they are good Christian soldiers. This is one area where the quest for moral legitimacy clashed with Nazi ideology. Hitler didn't want his soldiers worshiping with Soviet civilians, and he wanted them to believe in the war for ideological reasons, not to see it in religious terms. And there was a bit of a crackdown on Christianity within the army that upset quite a few of the troops. Still, many soldiers went the entire war believing that they were on the side of religion fighting against atheism. And this idea would persist into the post-war period, adding further fuel to the Wehrmacht myth. Another way that soldiers rationalized their participation in the war of extermination on a moral level, one that also was a surprise to me, was by reframing it as an act of liberation, a kind of humanitarian mission to save Soviet civilians from the horrors of Soviet rule. And I do have to mention, I believe Vladimir Putin has declared that his army are on a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine right now. So this is, certainly not unique in European history. This liberation idea was definitely a stretch given the horrible realities of the Wehrmacht's occupation, but it became a major feature of the army's discourse, especially early in the campaign. And one thing that fed into this was the fact that early on, there were quite a few civilians who actually did welcome the Wehrmacht. And this is a picture of the Wehrmacht being welcomed by Ukrainians. This is kind of its own complicated history, but many civilians in the Ukraine, but not just the Ukraine, also Belarus and other areas of Russia, many of them had suffered under Joseph Stalin and were hoping that the Germans might bring them an improvement to their situation, or in Ukraine, national independence, perhaps. And propagandists in the Wehrmacht took as much advantage as they could of this situation, hence this photograph. And you also see many ordinary soldiers and their letters buying into this liberation idea, talking about how happy the population was to see them. In the book, I go into a lot of detail about the relationship between soldiers and civilians, which is very, very complicated, shot through with racism and violence on one hand, but one thing that I found was a surprising number of soldiers who talked about the nice things that they were doing for civilians, talking about giving out candy to children, handing out cigarettes to men. There's one soldier who talked about chopping firewood so an old woman could survive the winter. And I want to emphasize that these gestures were nothing compared to the horror that the Wehrmacht visited upon the population. But for the individual soldier, they helped to solidify the illusion that they were virtuous liberators, that, this was a kind of friendly relationship. And when you look beyond the individual soldier to the units they belong to, you can see that in the midst of this terroristic occupation, many commanders instituted surprisingly conciliatory policies. Policies like rebuilding the local economy, giving medical care to civilians, organizing holiday festivals, and protecting civilians from marauding partisans. Actions like these went completely against Nazi racial ideology, but they helped to enhance the army's image and win locals over to German rule, thus ultimately helping the Nazi cause. The relationship between the Wehrmacht and the locals definitely soured over time as the Soviets realized that the Germans were no better than Stalin. But throughout the war, troops insisted that their occupation was a relatively benevolent affair, and that if anything, they were too nice to the inhabitants. And on the left-hand side, these are both pictures from Wehrmacht newspapers. On the left is German soldiers handing out food to grateful civilians, according to the caption. And on the right are soldiers helping put out fires that were started by the Soviets. So the final topic I discuss in my book is death and burial in the Wehrmacht, and how the army attempted to demonstrate that it was a civilized, enlightened institution that showed proper respect for the dead in contrast to the Soviets. At the start of the conflict, the Wehrmacht put considerable resources into the effort to give each fallen soldier an honorable burial, to construct beautiful cemeteries behind the lines, and to memorialize the sacrifices of its soldiers. The army even stated its commitment to burying Soviet soldiers with proper military honors, something the Soviet military itself didn't always do, even though the Wehrmacht didn't really honor this commitment. For the Wehrmacht, burial became yet another way of demonstrating moral superiority over the enemy and assuring the German public back home that their men's sacrifices were not in vain. Giving every fallen soldier full military honors became more and more challenging as the war went on. And I argue that the experience of mass death on the Eastern Front eventually gave way to a focus on victimhood. Soldiers wrote more and more about the physical hardships and psychological trauma they endured, the frigid winters, malnutrition, injuries, going years without seeing their loved ones. The list goes on. And more you see a kind of victimhood mentality creep in, which is very important in a moral sense, because if you see yourself as a victim, it's easier to excuse your own moral failings. This sense of victimhood would form yet another pillar of the Wehrmacht myth. So in conclusion, in terms of the moral landscape of the Wehrmacht, I find that the army was deeply influenced not just by ideology alone, but perhaps even more so by traditional morality. Older value systems showed up in numerous ways and had a major impact on the army's rhetoric and behavior on the Eastern Front. And it may sound like I'm saying the army wasn't quite as bad as we thought. I'm actually saying quite the opposite. The Wehrmacht as an institution was in many ways more complex and more dangerous than we thought. By incorporating a wide variety of value systems alongside Nazism, it was able to appeal to the vast majority of its men, including those who weren't necessarily committed Nazis. On the field, the army was able to camouflage its intentions, to hand out candy and play the role of a friendly liberator one day, only to turn around the next day and burn the village to the ground. The persistence of non-Nazi value systems in the Wehrmacht may have sometimes undermined the tenets of Nazi ideology in the short term, but in the long run, they made the army more dangerous, more united, and more able to effectively fulfill Hitler's goals, all while maintaining the illusion of virtue. In terms of how soldiers justified themselves and convinced themselves they were the good guys, my answer is, again, that they relied not just on ideology, but on a host of traditional moral values that preceded Nazism. With reference to these values, they constructed identities as decent men, good comrades, good fathers, brothers, and sons, who were supposedly fighting against an evil enemy for a righteous cause. And again, I'm not suggesting that the Wehrmacht was somehow better than we thought, and because perhaps fewer soldiers were as committed to Nazism as some historians have suggested. I'd like to suggest that even soldiers who weren't convinced Nazis, even those who really kept their distance from Nazism, and there were a few that I ran into, and soldiers who often recognized on some level that their actions were morally questionable, even these men were still able to not only participate, not only to go along, but to do so willingly while maintaining the illusion that they were good men making the world a better place. When it comes to the Wehrmacht myth, I hope I've proven today that its original authors were not politicians or generals in the post-war era, but ordinary soldiers who wielded the power of the pen to write a misleading narrative of what was happening on the Eastern Front, essentially writing their own history in real time and making themselves the virtuous heroes of their own stories. Their families on the home front readily accepted this version of events, and I believe that this explains why the myth became so quickly and so deeply entrenched in German society. And on one final note, I wonder that if I'm correct, and if an organization as heavily indoctrinated as the Wehrmacht had some trouble making a complete transition to Nazi morality, I wonder to what extent German civilians were also relying on traditional moral concepts to come to support Nazi goals. But that sounds like a topic for another book. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, David. And now we will just pass over to Professor Kühne.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me first thank the organizers of this event and the George Mosse program at the University of Wisconsin for having me today. I very much enjoyed reading David's book, and I am honored to be asked to offer some thoughts on it. The Virtuous Wehrmacht is an important contribution to a meanwhile rich body of research on the fighting morale and the complicity in the Nazi genocidal project of the about 17 million ordinary men that served with the German army from 1939 to 1945. Over decades, the dimensions of this complicity have been obfuscated. This obfuscation is now addressed as a myth of the Wehrmacht, as you just have heard from David's presentation. This myth has always been doubted from 1945 on, the late 1940s on, but for a very long time only by a few scholars, leftist critics, Nazi victims, and even then, mostly by pointing to the Wehrmacht leadership's complicity or their support of the crimes. Only in 1995, the German society confronted the large-scale complicity of ordinary soldiers when the Hamburg Institute for Social Research toured through Germany and also Austria with an exhibition on the crimes of the Wehrmacht. Amateur photos shown at this exhibition, amateur photos of the mass shootings of the Jews in the East suggested that ordinary German soldiers had witnessed, approved, and sometimes even enjoyed participating in the Holocaust. High school students visited the exhibition, looked at the photos, and recognized their own beloved grandpas applauding to the public humiliation of Jews. And there was much more. The mass deaths of Soviet POWs, plundering throughout the war, and unlimited destruction of lives and livelihoods of Soviet civilians when the army retreated from 1943 on. This exhibition was arranged in a sensationalist fashion by a movie maker and amateur historian, who in interviews at that time claimed that the majority of the 17 million servicemen had committed those crimes. This was a baseless exaggeration. Since then, historians have gone at great lengths to more solidly estimate that share. While exact figures will never be established, the estimates now range from 200,000 to 1 million soldiers committing crimes, an enormous number of soldiers, and yet clearly a minority of those 17 million. At least as important has been research that shows that by no means all or most of these soldiers indulged even in Nazi fanatism. The mindset of these soldiers were as diverse as the German society before, during, and after the regime. It is important to keep in mind that German society was ideologically tripartitioned when Hitler came into power. Very roughly spoken, 1/3 of Germans voted social democratic or communist, 1/3 adhered to political Catholicism, and 1/3 may be categorized as nationalist, liberal, conservative, and so on. In 1932, mostly voting Hitler. In the first 3 elections after 1945, these rough shares were renewed, indicating that the ideological affiliations had remained relatively stable, despite, of course, significant volatility under Hitler. In any case, ideological diversity prevailed throughout the 12 years of the Third Reich, in and outside of the Wehrmacht. And it needs to be kept in mind when we talk about the Wehrmacht that most of its soldiers were conscripted and coerced into it, whatever their political mindsets were, as opposed to the SS, the Einsatzgruppen, and other Nazi organizations. Yet, when we go back to the Wehrmacht, almost all of them did what they were supposed to do and what they were ordered to do, even at the time, 1944, early 1945, when they could and often did realize that Germany would lose a war, and disastrously so. They kept fighting no matter what, instead of deserting or defecting. In part, they did so because they didn't have another option, given the coercive structure of the army and the regime that commanded it. But coercion doesn't explain all of it. Instead, as scholars such as Klaus Latzel, Stephen Fritz, Christian Hartmann, Sönke Neitzel, and yours truly have shown, most soldiers adhere to ideologies, imageries, identities, fears, and visions that overlap partially, but not completely with the Nazi agenda. David has addressed this very important issue. I want to give one example. The soldier, for instance, who volunteered to the army to pursue a military career and who had internalized the standards of honorable warfare, including the norm of to spare unarmored enemies, and, for instance, the virtue of comradeship, the iron law that requires unlimited solidarity with the buddies of your unit and to never let them down, whatever happens. This soldier may yet have engaged in killing civilians or POWs after their commander or Nazi propagandists made them believe that those civilians, in fact, weren't civilians, but actual or hidden partisans who only waited for the moment to insidiously kill that soldier and his comrades, or whoever, or who already had killed German soldiers this way. Another type of soldier is at the core of David's book, the Christian believers who were appalled by the murder of the Jews and the widespread abuse of civilian population in the East, and yet were driven by anti-communism, buying into Nazi propaganda about the lethal threat that Germany and Europe supposedly faced from the barbaric Soviet Bolshevists. David's book contributes to this stream of nuanced research on the Wehrmacht by zeroing in on this large group of Christian believers, and David deserves substantial credit for being one of the first historians to do so. The authors, the scholars I have just mentioned, and I have to say, including myself, for a long time did neglect studying the mindsets and actions of Christian believers among the Wehrmacht. That is a very important contribution. Now, reading well-selected private letters, David shows that these soldiers try to counter the criminal and genocidal dimensions of the war they yet fought by first practicing Christian ceremonies and gathering in small groups of believers to preserve their faith and values, by contributing to the efforts of their chaplains to re-Christianize the victims of Soviet-enforced secularization, and by upholding gestures of generosity and cordiality to the civilian population of the conquered territories. This way, the soldiers try to save their own identities as Christians from Nazification and from absorption into the maelstrom of criminal and genocidal warfare. So David arguing. All this stood in the Judeo-Christian tradition of universal morality that contradicted the racist, particularistic Nazi morality, according to which, in Himmler's infamous words, good was only what was good for Aryan Germans. David also argues, as we have heard, that this stream of religious practices and identities was established already during the war as the myth of the Wehrmacht as an army that had steered clear of crimes and genocide. Let me now address three issues that, in my humble view, deserve further attention and may be more complex analyses than David was able to provide in a research project that by nature is always limited. I want to talk first on the use and interpretation of the private war letters that base David's arguments. Secondly, I want to talk about the consequences of the moral and emotional conflicts Christian soldiers faced during the war. And thirdly, I will be briefly addressing the issue of continuity or discontinuity of the Wehrmacht myth, meaning whether it indeed makes sense to date its genesis right in the war instead of only in the post-war period. First, the letters. Private war letters are a great source to explore mindsets of ordinary soldiers, but their content is misleading if we as historians don't consider their biases, limitations, and misrepresentations. No doubt, the letters used in this book do tell a lot about the ambitions of the writers. These writer soldiers went at great lengths to prove to their readers, their loved ones at home, but also to themselves, as David in his book says, that they had not turned into monsters and instead kept their identities as dutiful family men, selfless comrades, faithful Christians, virtuous heroes, and so on and so forth. But what does that mean for the soldiers' mindsets, their emotions, the way they felt about the war and thought about the war they fought, and the daily crimes and atrocities they witnessed or committed themselves? In other words, can we trust these letters? When these letters, private war letters in the 1980s and 1990s were kind of discovered as a mass source of war experiences and so on, there was a lot of enthusiasm at that time about the allegedly authentic voice of soldiers they seem to represent. But this is an illusion. These letters do not reflect authentically what went on inside or between the soldiers. They reflect what the soldiers wanted their loved ones at home to believe, and to a certain degree also what they, the soldiers themselves, wanted to be. That is a serious problem for any study that relies on letters only. The only way to get to a more complex picture is to use, compare, and triangulate different types of sources, different types of ego documents, including diaries, memoirs, testimonies, also photos, for instance. Diaries, for instance, do have a similar role as letters have, but in terms of self-confirmation of the writer, but they are less reader-oriented. Private diaries cannot be taken at face value either, but often they reflect a little more of the emotional and moral quagmire the soldiers saw themselves thrown in. Take Wilhelm Hosenfeld as an example, about whose mindset we know a lot thanks to the letters and diaries he wrote. Hosenfeld, a Catholic, was the Wehrmacht captain who in 1944 helped the Jewish pianist Wladislaw Spielmann in Warsaw to hide and survive in the ruins of Warsaw. That is what he is famous for now. Hosenfeld learned about the Nazis' annihilation program early and was horrified, shaken to the core by, as he said it, horrible blood guilt that would now burden the entire German people. What cowards we are that we let this all happen, he wrote to his wife. He understood the mechanisms that made bystanders complicit in evil. By doing nothing, they demonstrated approval, even if they didn't mean it. Hosenfeld knew that his uniform, and even more his remaining on duty as a German soldier, made him complicit, notwithstanding the fact that he rescued Jewish and non-Jewish Poles, or despite any ceremonies, Christian ceremonies, he and the like he attended. Well, why does that matter? Not all soldiers were able to sort out the quagmire they faced. Instead, guilt feelings about their complicity in a genocidal war of hitherto unforeseen dimensions determined their mindsets from the beginning on, and these guilt feelings never left them, neither before nor after the capitulation, whatever the soldiers tried to do to suppress them. Relying too much on one genre of sources, such as letters, is afflicted with another bias we need to be aware of. Educated people are more likely than others to write personal diaries and contemplative letters in order to make sense of their situation and their own acting under circumstances not under their control. German soldiers in World War II wrote millions of private letters, but not all of these soldiers did so in the same fashion. Many did not write anything at all. In fact, many soldiers frowned upon wasting time on letter or diary writing. Those who did so anyway ran the risk of being seen as outsiders who hadn't managed to adjust to the all-male, hyper-masculine, misogynistic society of soldiers at war, who sank into merciless cynicism and fought enemy soldiers just as they executed brutal violence among themselves and against enemy civilians. In other words, we don't know how non-literate or less literate soldiers, even with a Christian background, dealt with their guilt feelings. Not to talk of the masses of those soldiers who no longer adhered to any Christian moralities at all, but indulged into the racist Nazi morality, according to which murdering Jews and members of other allegedly inferior races was not a crime, but deemed morally good. David rightly notices that the religious belief system lost its power to help Christians ordering their moral quagmire the more the war went on, and the more death in their own rows reached previously unimaginable levels. Soldiers got numb, as David occasionally notices, rightly so. In my view, and based on a broad range of letters, diaries, and testimonies, this numbing process started very early. Fritz Farnbacher may serve as an example for that. His private diary reveals the moral and emotional roller coaster. Farnbacher was a Protestant believer who served as a lieutenant with the tank division in the East. From day one on, he felt uneasy about the strange war in Russia, as he noted in his diary. Though, of course, as he said, the troops had to be fed off the land, it bothered him a lot that all manner of things are being pinched. That's what he wrote in late June 1941. At about that time, he became horrified by observing how a Soviet POW, allegedly a communist commissar, was simply bumped off by his unit leader. But it didn't take long for Farnbacher to engage himself in and even enjoy plundering and to adopt the no mercy attitude toward Russian civilians that Wehrmacht orders justified by pointing to the partisan threat the civilians allegedly embodied. Neither did his comrades when in charge of transferring a group of 30 or so captives to a collection point. They have bumped off all of them, as they tell us later. The assembly point was so far away. What I hear is an almost animal laughter, Farnbacher noted, understanding, and yet disturbed. This type of doubts surfaced again and again and needed to be suppressed, of course. But the suppression did not work. In late December 1941, Farnbacher wrote, "What have we come to? 5 months ago, we wouldn't have even said that, let alone dare to do it. And today, it's a matter of course, which on reflection, every one of us approves. No mercy for these predators and beasts." What Farnbacher's diary shows exemplarily is how soldiers, including the Christian ones, more and more sank into a couldn't care less attitude, a moral and emotional state of cynicism, in which remnants of Christian values drowned and merged with cold-blooded, murderous racism. Well, why does that matter? Or what does that mean for the myth of the Wehrmacht? I doubt that we can date its genesis back to the war itself. The Wehrmacht myth implies that the soldiers fought honorably, but did not, unlike the SS, commit or witness in their own troops crimes against humanity or war crimes on a large-scale basis. The truth is that the soldiers knew from early on about the criminal dimension of the war, and they knew about their implication. And they didn't simply forget about it when at the end of the war, they transitioned indeed into victims. Instead, at that time, 1944 and 1945, they were driven by haunting fears of revenge of the Soviets, the Jews, or the Americans if the Germans would lose the war. Revenge, what for? Well, for the crimes they had committed a few years before, or their comrades had committed. The myth of the Wehrmacht is a post-war fabrication, although an early one. Its authors were mostly those soldiers that had served from 1939, 1940, 1941 on, often as junior officers or NCOs, and now in the late 1940s returned to a hopeful post-war societies. Now in their 20s or 30s, when the war was over, they were eager to continue their lives by benefiting from the merits of their serving for their fatherland. They needed to whitewash the reputation of the Wehrmacht so that the new democratic state and society could honor their sacrifices for the fatherland, and most of all, the proof of manhood they had given on the battlefields across Europe, not least by their heroic resilience still at the end of the war, by not quitting no matter what. This record was what qualified them as leaders of the new states. As is known, they were stunningly successful. Former Wehrmacht servicemen kept most leading positions in West German society through the 1980s and early 1990s, and only then, when they retired due to old age, a new generation of Germans demystified the myth of comradeship. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Kühne. David, I imagine you'd want to provide a response, or should I go into questions? Give you a couple minutes at least.
Sure, I can kind of make a couple points and then we can go into questions. So thank you very much, Professor Kühne, for your comments. And I guess I wanted to touch on a couple of the points you made. The first one about, can we trust soldiers' letters? And I certainly agree that there are many reasons to not to trust them. Men, had a tendency to leave out certain incriminating details, to to sound more optimistic than they actually were, and so on and so forth. The reason that I was drawn to letters, however, is because I don't know if they actually give us a sense of what exactly soldiers believed or what exactly they were thinking. I'm more interested in the image they were trying to project, whether that's to themselves or to their readers. So I want to see kind of the justifications, the self-presentation, and whether or not soldiers completely believed everything that they wrote in their letters. I'm not sure. That's one reason I looked at some diaries, was to do a bit of comparison. And I was actually struck by how similar a lot of the letters were to the diaries, in fact. So I think letters are certainly a problematic source in many ways, but I think it's actually their problematic nature that makes my argument work. As to the question of when the Wehrmacht myth originated, well, I suppose we disagree on that point. I see, not necessarily a complete myth having been created by the end of the war, but soldiers who by and large maintain the idea that they are on the right side, that they're fighting for a righteous cause, or that they're victims, or that they fought a war that they could justify, and come out the other end feeling virtuous. So I think you can debate about how exactly well developed these arguments were during the war, but I would say that so many of the points that you see in the post-war period are already there during the war. And on the subject of crimes, I think soldiers were not silent about them during the war, but it's almost like they kind of took care of that issue during the war through their letters. They wrote about their crimes, they justified their crimes, and I think that helped to create the relative silence after the war, because they had already sort of swept that issue under the rug. So those are just a couple of thoughts that come to mind, but I'd be happy to continue the discussion, certainly. But Chad, if you want to go ahead with the Q&A, that would be great.